of fundamental causality, find a consensus within the communities that are still respected, the academics, whatever their flaws and weaknesses. There's still an awful lot of influence, including influence over governmental policy and so on, making a case that there's something we need to look at that isn't about policy making, but the thing that makes the policy. And if there's a problem there, that would, I suspect, presuming there was a widespread consensus, that's where the problem is, that would make our decision making very different. If, for example, and I'll say this fairly blatantly, if it was accepted that there was a species-wide neurodegenerative condition that was influencing our perception, and it affected some people more than others, we're all in the same boat together, it's nobody's fault. But the people who aspire to take control, there's a certain psychology there, it attracts a certain kind of people, have less ability to see reality, and we expect those people, through no fault of their own, to make decisions on our behalf, then we're all responsible for this situation. And if that were the case, it would become imperative to make some radical changes before we get to the symptoms, the decision-making processes, because if we don't get that right, we'll never deal with the symptoms.
That's right. And what kind of response have you had to the book so far?
So far, it's been exceptional. I'm totally aware of what I'm saying is quite challenging, although we're talking symptoms here, and we do seem to be living in one giant madhouse. So I purposely ran the basic theory past some of the sharpest minds I could reach, bearing in mind it's quite difficult to get stuff to people and they're always so busy. And so far it's been phenomenal, really, sort of some of the sharpest minds in anthropology, neurology, so on and so forth. The general view is the bits that I've taken from their disciplines fit, and they can see the sense in it. Of course, they're also aware, so, well, okay, we're kind of looking at this through blinkered vision, and that's the problem. What the hell do we then do? But at least it's a start of a consensus, and it really takes the problem back to, call it neurology, call it consciousness, call it whatever you like, but it takes it to a much more fundamental level. And we already know, you can use crude examples, whether it be mechanical damage or the traditional use of plant chemicals. You change the biochemistry and the structure a little bit, and the behavioral changes can be quite radical. And if we can figure out a way to take what may be a less than functional consciousness system that will inevitably create mayhem and change it to something that's more empathic and will not create mayhem, that's got to be worth looking at, I think.
Well, one of the things that you also talk about in the book is telepathy. You were talking about some of the sort of ancient tribes on the planet had this ability to communicate without talking and know what they were thinking, each others were thinking. And I know that does pop up every now and again, and people do talk about that sometimes. But that is presumably again something we've lost because of our dietary change. Would you see it that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think the mechanism that I'm interested in could provide a framework for explaining a lot of these very anecdotal reports, quite weak evidence or some evidence, but it's never, if it were great big spikes on oscilloscopes, it would be wheeled out and, well, here it is, we've got it. It's always quite subtle, or we got something now, we can't repeat it. If it's as simple as the structural limitations of the dominant side of our brain or the problem, then it makes an awful lot of sense. And if all the experiments were running, bearing in mind the academics would presume that we're functional, how do we work, and they like to have normal reference points. Nobody's really questioned those normal reference points. It's actually, as far as I understand, it's very bad science to presume that your only tool of investigation is functional. And that's never really been asked. So if we ask that question and change some of the parameters, we might get some radically different results. If, for example, we were to presume there might be a limit here, and we try and access the more functional side of the brain and run the same experiments, who knows?
So what kind of experiments would you run?
I suppose you'd start with the kind of traditional ideas around how to enhance states of consciousness, maybe bring them together in a controlled environment as safe as possible, bearing in mind that it's not exactly like we're living in safe times and nobody's getting harmed at the minute. I think it's worth pushing the envelope a bit and asking some different questions. So yeah, I mean, looking at the basic engineering, changing diet, approximating what our primate relatives eat, the kind of stuff I talked about before. There would be no contradiction there in the academic world. They generally were considered primates, so no problem there. It's not what we do at the minute. That isn't part of the normal experimental regime. Bit of a paradox, I think. Then maybe looking at some of the ideas, I've talked about sleep deprivation. It's quite a challenging idea, but it's a traditional tool. We're quite happy to prescribe antidepressants. Well, maybe we should be looking at the plant biochemistry that's part of the primate diet and replicate that and see how that affects our neural system's incredibly sensitive to chemicals. If we're now clinically deficient in chemicals, again, it's not going to work properly. And yeah, it brings up all sorts of reactions. Oh, well, chemical use, drug use is potentially dangerous. Well, yes, it is potentially dangerous. But being clinically deficient in chemicals is also dangerous.
Yeah.
So there's lots of things we can start looking at that are going on anyway, let's face it, put them in a clinical, safe surroundings and run some different experiments and see what we get.
So how do you live your life? Obviously, you follow the diet. What else do you do that is maybe different from the average person?
I've tried to maintain, again, I call it an approximation. It's not exactly the same. The species are different. It's basically what's available locally and limited by my finances. So it's a poor approximation of a primate diet, but it still seems to make quite a difference. Most of the techniques I'm interested in, at best, seem to allow brief windows of something utterly different, which is fascinating in itself. However, what I've tended to focus on in the last, say, 7 or 8 years is how to formulate this idea into a map that people can understand and may feel compelled to take some action over. And that is a little bit more mundane than, say, spending days awake and using other approaches to try and access those windows, which are fascinating and more than fascinating, but never come up with any different answers. So I'm really focused on selling the idea of a map at the minute, a diagnosis, trying to generate some interest, and then see if we can find the resources to move on and do something about it.
But I think you talk in the book that you're also meditating.
Yeah, I don't have a formal regime. What happened, I mean, I mentioned the initial experience that kind of galvanized my interest into almost a compulsive quest to find out what was going on. And I spent, I think, where was that, in 1995, probably up till 1998, doing an awful lot of experimental, a lot of sleep deprivation, a lot of other approaches. And I noticed off the back of that, because as I said, I'd never gone gently into this, I'd never got interested in meditating, I kind of almost jumped in at the deep end by accident. I found that just relaxing, and I'd end up in a, what I suppose I'd term as a mildly meditative or hypnagogic state where I was much more relaxed, much more creative. So yeah, I don't have a formal regime, but I can quite easily switch my mind off to some degree, not as well as if I stay awake for 3 or 4 days. And I find it particularly useful if I'm trying to reformulate an idea that's more accessible. I just relax, and it seems to be quite easy to do that. But then I tend to regard those states as very embryonic. I don't regard them as... I actually think we're in very serious trouble, and I think a lot of the experiences people have, including my own, are just a glimpse of what's possible rather than, oh, this is fully functional. We're
very driven, aren't we, as a human race? Most of us, especially in the West, we're very somehow pushed to do things and to succeed, and it's maybe, I don't know, this is maybe not quite as clear as I'd like to say it, but it's somehow we're trying to find wholeness and completeness through the maximising of our individuality as opposed to relaxing. And as you're suggesting, let something else that is already there be our reality.
I don't think we can help ourselves. I don't, we can all see the symptoms, but if through nobody's fault, if we've ended up with a phenomenal piece of equipment being inadvertently damaged and it's in charge, it cannot help but follow what its reality is, which is very limited, separate, frightened, etc., etc., and it creates the world in its own image. That's what we've done, I think. I think all we see around us is a reflection of the internal, again, it's a harsh word, but the internal damage is reflected in the world we create, even though we know there are glimpses beyond that. They're not dominant, they're not in charge, so we're being led by, the traditions call it the ego and the fear and so on. Well, I'm simply saying there's a neurological correlate here, and we just can't help ourselves. Unless we understand the symptomology, unless we can figure out why that's the case, then maybe we can take a step back. That isn't going to fix it, but at least we can explain in rational terms to the rational mind that is in charge in a language that even it will understand. So that's why I tend to use these neurological terms, not because they're any more or less arbitrary than any other term, but that it's a terminology the rational mind can understand. So if you talk about chemical deficiency, hormonal retardation, limited perception, inability to perceive reality, that makes a lot more sense to the rational mind than maybe talking about how do we find our spiritual path or whatever. I think they're the same thing, but they don't mean the same thing anymore to a mind that it's like, well, what are you talking about? I want to go and buy a new car, or, but if you say, well, hang on, there's a neurological problem here, people's ears prick up immediately. And I say, oh, I understand that. And if that's where we've got to start from, not as a final solution, then it's worth, I think, having a look at.
Okay, good. Thanks very much for coming along.
Thanks very much.
Tony, spending some time with us. This is Tony's book, Left in the Dark, which I can thoroughly recommend as a very stimulating read. And thanks again. Thank you for watching TV, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. Goodbye.